You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer vows to restore faith in government after his Labour Party's landslide victory. What does it mean for the country and beyond? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. By any measure, it was a resounding defeat for Conservatives. Labour's win in the UK's parliamentary elections ended 14 years of Conservative government, securing two-thirds of the seats in the House of Commons. The landslide victory marked a huge turnaround for the party, 4.5 years after Keir Starmer took over as leader and less than 5 since Jeremy Corbyn led them to its worst defeat since the 1930s. We begin with this report from CGTN's Michael Voss.
Large crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as the Labour Party leader Keir Starmer arrived for his meeting with King Charles for the constitutional handing over of political power. Then it was off to 10 Downing Street to give his first speech as Prime Minister. This was an historic victory for Labour, replacing a huge Conservative majority with an even larger one of their own, the biggest swing in history.
I say to you directly, my government will serve you. Politics can be a force for good. We will show that. We've changed the Labour Party, returned it to service, and that is how we will govern. Country first, party second.
Earlier, it was a dejected outgoing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak who made his final exit from number 10. Announcing that he will also step down as the Conservative Party leader.
You have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters. I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
Among the many high-profile Conservative losses was the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, who is now no longer an MP. The other big winners are the Liberal Democrats, who with more than 70 seats now have the largest number of MPs in their history. The newly formed right-wing populist Reform Party won a substantial share of the national vote, but only managed 4 MPs, including its leader, Nigel Farage. The Greens also achieved their highest ever representation, winning 4 seats. But the pro-independent Scottish Nationalist Party was a major loser, with Labour making substantial gains in Scotland. Overnight, there were ecstatic scenes at Keir Starmer's constituency as the size of the victory sunk in. He now has a very big mandate to govern, but given the state of the economy he inherits, it won't be an easy task. Michael Voss, CGTN, London.
There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Klaus Larres is a history and international affairs professor with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. David Tereshchuk is a veteran journalist and commentator. Also with us is Kevin Matthews. He's a history professor at George Mason University. And Wayne Fitzgerald is the leader of Britain's Peterborough City Council and chair of the Peterborough Conservative Association. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Wayne, let me start with you. As we have been saying it, as the British media have been saying it, it was a landslide victory for the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, with almost all seats declared. Labour has 412 seats, the Conservatives 121 seats. So, question is, we knew before the election the polls were pointing to a defeat for the Conservatives, but did you expect it to be this big?
Anand, it's a pleasure to be back with you from the UK. There were varying results being predicted, with seats as low as 60 for the Conservative Party. So I'm pleasantly surprised on a personal basis that they remained at over 120 as it is. But the fact is, I lost some very good colleagues by very slim numbers. In Peterborough here, we lost our sitting MP by 118 votes, which was predicted to be a Labour landslide of several thousand. And in my neighbouring constituency, again, less than 40 votes, we lost the North West Cambridgeshire MP. So that pattern, while I can relate to that locally, actually appeared all over the country. And there's only one party or one person to blame for that in terms of the votes went to Nigel Farage's reform. Now, there is an element of truth that the party did shoot itself in the foot because those people voted reform because they lost their way with the Conservative Party.
And Wayne, I mean, in retrospect, how big a mistake was it for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to call an early general election?
Well, from a personal point of view, having been an active campaigner for most of my adult life, I'd much rather be campaigning now in the sunshine rather than in the wind, rain and snow in November. So when he called it, it was always going to be the same. I think the path was set with the demise of Boris Johnson several years ago, and you've heard me talk about that before. That's where it started to go wrong with the internal divisions within the Conservative Party. So I don't think it would have mattered, Anand, whether he called it now or whether he called it in November.
Okay, David, great to see you, David. The United Kingdom has faced tough times over the past 14 years of Conservative rule, Brexit being one of them, the sort of tone-deaf response to COVID being another. Then we had the skyrocketing cost of living to the point where the government had to introduce food banks in the country. Given all of that, I mean, is it fair to say that as far as the voters were concerned, this was more a rejection of the Conservatives rather than a wholesome embrace of Labour?
I think almost certainly it was a rejection of Toryism. The British public have been used to 14 years of it now, and you could just say, just on a very simple basis, 14 years was enough. But it was 14 years that left Britain very much poorer than it was in 2010. You mentioned food banks. In 2010, I don't remember there being any around Britain, either in urban areas or rural areas. But last year saw 3 million food bank packages being handed out, doubling what it was the previous year. Overall, I mean, on economic terms, macroeconomics, the country's economic growth rate was 0.1% last year. And in human terms, the proportion of children living below the poverty line has been climbing fast, now accounting for more than a quarter of the nation's youth, amazingly. And that's a faster climb than any such increase over the past 30 years, back to the Thatcher years. And the watchword under the Conservatives was austerity, which they proudly vaunted as tough but essential medicine the country needed after the financial crisis of 2008. But it brought massive cuts in public spending with the inevitable results. And so no wonder the British public were as jaundiced and in the end so angry, as the Prime Minister himself said. He heard their anger. They were very angry, and there was no other way to go except to throw the bums out, as they say in American politics.
Kevin Matthews, good to have you with us as well. Now, in one of his first acts as the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer scrapped that very controversial plan by the Conservatives to deport those seeking asylum in the United Kingdom, and he was going to deport them to the Central African country of Rwanda. How is that going to be seen?
Well, thank you for having me on. Almost immediately, Starmer said that he's not going to have anything to do with this policy. The issue, though, is what do you do about immigration? And this isn't a problem just for the UK, it's an international problem. You can go the route that Australia has taken and have very strict restrictions. But I don't think that Starmer can do anything without cooperating with Europe. And that's going to be his real challenge. He has already said that under this Labour government anyway, he will not talk about going back into the EU, back into the single market. And that's going to tie his hands because Brexit has really been a disaster for the British people. The British Chamber of Commerce said that something like 60% of its members have reported that they're having more trouble this year than even just last year with trading with the EU. So Starmer really has got to focus on domestic issues right now. the British people did not hand him a victory so much as they handed the Conservatives an historic defeat.
Yeah.
And for Starmer, I think it would be well for him to remember the past, because in 1906, the same thing happened when the Liberals handed the Conservatives defeat on the same scale. And the historian George Dangerfield later wrote that it was a landslide by any measure, but it was one from which the Liberals never recovered. They never held office again, never won a victory again without the help of other parties. And given the volatility of the voters right now, not just in the UK, but in many parts of the world, Starmer can't count on succeeding or having a second victory unless he gets the first government right.
Klaus Larres, I'm wondering to what extent the outcome of this British election is really an outlier. When we look at sort of current political trends in the rest of Europe, and we look at recent elections in Italy, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France as well, there's been a shift to the right. But now in the United Kingdom, we see a shift to the centre-left.
Yeah, overnight Britain has become almost an island of stability in Europe once again. You know, since Brexit, Britain wasn't really represented very much on the global scale. They had an awful lot to do with themselves, and everyone really ignored them on the international scale, apart from a few areas. But now Starmer has found a newfound stability for Britain, and that gives Britain the unique opportunity to really play a much more important global role once again, as it has traditionally done. And regarding Europe, we will see a rapprochement with the European Union, not a rejoining of the European Union, which would be domestically, I think, still very, very difficult, but there will be a sectoral rapprochement with Europe. Starmer has been talking about an ambitious security pact he wants to conclude with the European Union. We also will see sectoral cooperation in the scientific area, in space collaboration, in the exchange of students and university exchanges. All that will help to bring Britain much closer to Europe than it has been since Brexit. And I think that will be good both for the UK and for the Europeans.
Wayne, what is your view on that? What kind of relationship do you see Britain under Starmer hoping to have with the European Union?
I don't accept that Britain has a bad relationship with the European Union. We have a change relationship. And I also don't accept entirely that Britain has done badly since Brexit. Yes, there are problems. There would always be problems, but nobody expected a war. Nobody expected a pandemic. But Britain's trade figures in terms of exports are up. They're better than most of the G7 countries. That's my understanding of the economy, but it's all skewed at the moment. And I'd also say, yes, the growth rates are particularly slow, and they were better before than the last since 2010. I think about 4.25% in the last measurements that we've done. And it is much lower than the OBR forecast, but it will be the same under Starmer. And those relationships with Europe and trade, fine, I'm all for improvements, but he set out no plans on how he would do that.
Right. Klaus Larres, what is your brief response to that the relationship with Europe has been not as bad as it's made out to be?
Well, under Sunak, fences were mended, and Sunak deserves quite a bit of credit for trying to have a rapprochement with Europe. Under Boris Johnson, relations with the European Union were outright hostile. They were hardly on speaking terms, and Boris Johnson was seen as an extremely difficult prime minister who was really quite incompetent, not up to job. That changed under Sunak, and I would say that it will change even more under Starmer, because there's a lot of goodwill in Europe for Britain. And Britain, of course, has done important tasks in the recent past, like its very strong support for Ukraine, which is appreciated everywhere in the European Union.
Okay. David, there is one foreign policy issue which has generated a great deal of controversy and a great deal of anger, really, and that is the Labour leader's views on the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. Now, according to reports in both CNN and the London broadcaster LBC, Starmer said that Israel has the right to deny water and electricity to Palestinian civilians. In fact, Labour actually paid for this view during the election when we saw that Muslim voters, or at least voters in Muslim majority constituencies, drifted away from Labour. Starmer said the quote was taken out of context. But, you know, we know that the United Kingdom also supplies arms to Israel. It also helps Israel out with intelligence. Do you expect there to be any change in that policy?
Well, I think some missteps were made, certainly, in the course of the campaign. There was an attempt to walk back that unfortunate expression of what was intended to be, I think, only support for the right of Israel to defend itself. But it came out a lot worse than that. It was the idea of cutting off water to the Palestinians was a really politically stupid thing to say. And you're right, he paid for it. Just the Gaza issue itself lost them lots of votes, and not just amongst Muslim populations and Muslim communities in Labour constituencies, but much more broadly too. I think in terms of action moving forward, Starmer is said to be in favor of a two-state solution, as many politicians in the West are. But he's coming under a lot of pressure to even go as far as to recognize Palestinian statehood early. Now, that's kind of uncertain, but I think the wind is blowing in a certain direction for the Labour Party when it comes to the Israel-Hamas war. And we should watch it very carefully and look for something that might, in the end, constitute considerable change.
Kevin, the United Kingdom likes to tout its, what it calls its special relationship with the United States. I mean, post-Brexit, it was hoped that there would be some big trade deal with the United States. I mean, is that something that the new Prime Minister is going to continue to push?
He probably will, but I mean, to Labour's credit, the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has already reached out to both Republicans and Democrats in this country, but all is going to depend on the American elections in November. Now, if the Democrat, whether it's President Biden or an alternative, wins, I think Labor is going to have a much smoother road. But if it's Donald Trump, everything will be transactional. And so all bets are off. David Lammy can have all the talks he wants with Republican operatives, but it will all come down to what Trump wants.
Klaus Larres, how do you see Starmer dealing with the United States? I mean, there is a likelihood, there's a possibility that Donald Trump could be back in the White House. How does that change things?
That will, of course, be difficult for any Western country if Donald Trump is back, but the UK will make a strenuous effort to be on the good side of the United States. Recently, relations have not been all that great. The trade deal, which was promised during the Brexit negotiations, never materialized with the United States, so there's room for improvement. But the United States will be happy to see a Britain back in international affairs, a stronger Britain, a more stable Britain, a Britain which is not just concerned with itself. And I think they will welcome Starmer's victory in order to see a more stable, more stronger Britain. Trump is a difficult president. He was very difficult for the Western world during his first term. If he comes back, the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has a little bit of a problem on his hands, because years ago he criticized Trump quite severely, and Trump is someone who hardly ever forgets insults and personal attacks on himself. And in the recent past, for example, during Lammy's recent visit to Washington, he scaled back any criticism of Trump and tried to make good and tried to say constructive things about Trump. So the British are well aware that if there is a new Trump administration, this will be difficult to deal with, and Trump has to be dealt with in a very cautious way.
Right. Wayne, I want to get back to some of the domestic changes that we've seen after this election. And one of the things is something that you've already talked about, and that is the Reform Party in Britain and its leader, Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, who tried 7 times to get into Parliament. 8th time lucky for him. He's going to be getting a seat in Parliament now. It's a right-wing populist party. That's how it's been described. And it got a significant chunk of votes during this election. But under Britain's first past the post system, that only translates into 5 seats. And as you pointed out, it took away a significant number of votes from the Conservatives. What's the attraction with reform?
I don't know if you've ever met Nigel Farage, and I have several times. I've had a pint with him, as we might say here, and he's a very engaging politician. Excuse me, my phones are falling out. And if you meet him, you get drawn into the Farage effect. So the public here in Britain have taken to Nigel Farage because he's a straight talker. He's a man in the pub that says it how it is. And that's what people like about him. I like Nigel Farage, and I like some of the things he says, but unfortunately there is no depth to his policies, and that is the problem. And the main thing that Farage and the entourage bang on about, as was exposed in a Channel 4 TV interview recently, it is about immigration. It is about the policies of division, and the Conservatives have more depth than that. Now, whether or not he will go on to be an effective MP in Clacton, I don't know, because it's reported he's on £1 million contract with GB News. Will he want to give all that up for an £80,000 salary? I don't know. But it's Farage that is the magnet, and without Farage, Reform were doing nothing. They were dead in the water. But it's him that's pulled it around in the last 4 to 6 weeks, and that's why we're seeing swathes of votes, 10,000 in many constituencies, or 5,000 in the case of here. That 5,000 with our Tory vote would have seen our MPs elected, and that's up and down the country.
David, as we saw in the introduction to the programme, Starmer will lead what he calls a government of service on a mission of national renewal. Ordinary Britons are facing severe hardships, as we have been seeing. I mentioned the food banks, you mentioned it as well. Then, of course, there have been strikes. Railway workers, teachers, healthcare workers went on strike, and the vaunted British public health system, known as the NHS, is under severe stress right now. Here is Keir Starmer talking about some of the challenges that he will face. Let's watch.
Changing a country is not like flicking a switch. The world is now a more volatile place. This will take a while, but have no doubt that the work of change begins immediately. Have no doubt that we will rebuild Britain with wealth created in every community.
So, David, a lot on the agenda for the new Prime Minister. What, though, are his priorities?
Well, I'll say a lot. Yes, indeed. And he also said that he would be representing a government of stability and moderation. Now, that's not a very exciting motto to go into work with. But in fact, it's going to, from all the signs are that it's going to be what typifies their approach. This Labour Party, now Labour government, is absolutely banking on growth. And not every Labour Party, certainly not various incarnations of the Labour Party we've known in recent years, is so committed to growth. This government will be. I'm convinced of that, and right from things like the mission for national renewal, which in practical terms will take the shape of a national wealth fund. That's going to be one of the first things that emanates from Downing Street, a combination of effort which is government-led, but that will involve the business community, and its main intention to encourage business investment. So that you will end up, this is the theory at least, and this is what they're hoping for, is growth which will pay for the improvements in the national health, the National Health Service, which Britons are so proudly, are traditionally so proud of. And in good times, that's entirely deserved, and they can get back to being proud of it. But also the education service is in desperate need of improvement too, and money needs to be spent on that too. They're committed to probably new taxes that will amount to something like £7 billion in the coming years. And that's going to help them, but they're also going to have to borrow. Unpleasant though that is, especially when they've been criticizing the way that the Tories borrowed. But as I say, this will all be done in careful and moderate ways in which they hope that it will walk the line and get the improvement that they want without spending too much and putting the country into too much debt.
Kevin, just getting back to the point that David raised there about Starmer's looking for stability in government. I mean, given how tumultuous the last few years in British politics has been, I mean, there's been something like, what, 5 prime ministers, one of whom, Liz Truss, only lasted 49 days. I mean, do you see a period of relative stability in politics in Britain? I mean, what will the British people be looking for now?
Well, I think what they're looking for most is to get the country back on its feet again, after not just Tory mismanagement in the last few years, but since 2010, when David Cameron and his Chancellor of the Exchequer embarked on this pointless policy of austerity, and they've just driven down the public services in the UK. Not just the NHS, but transport and a host of other things. That's one of the problems about Brexit. I don't think we can get away from that. It's estimated that 4 to 6% of GDP has been lost, and it can be traced directly to Brexit. The British Treasury has 40 billion pounds less to spend now that Starmer is in office. That's roughly 51 billion US dollars. So they've really got themselves in a very bad spot right now, thanks to those earlier policies. And while Gaza is important, it's estimated that the Labour lost 5 seats that they might have gained because independents fought on a pro-Gaza platform. While that's true, I think most British voters right now are more concerned with what is hitting them at home. And unless Starmer can find a magic pot of money somewhere, he's going to have to raise taxes. Right. And that immediately will open him up to a lot of criticism from the right, that he was a tax raiser all along. So he's really up against it.
Wayne, very quickly, I've got less than 30 seconds left, but as far as the British economy is concerned, I mean, we've heard from David, we've heard from Kevin as well, telling us about the kind of challenges that Starmer faces. He could either cut public spending, raise taxes, he's going to have to borrow. Is it all of the above?
He's going to, but he lied about it in the election. Look, and the reason why we had no money or austerity, because of the note that was left in the Treasury, in the drawer that said there's no money. Because with the Labour Party, there's always too much month left at the end of the money. Right. And that's what will happen again as we go through the cycle, and they'll have to borrow and tax. That's the only way to pay for it.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.